Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the launch webinar for our new report on how the conflict in Tigray is affecting its decades-old environmental restoration program. My name is Doug Weir, and I'm the Research and Policy Director of the Conflict and Environment Observatory, CEOBS. CEOBS is a UK charity working to increase the protection of people and ecosystems from the impact of armed conflicts and military activities. Our new report on Tigray is available on our website, and you can find a link to it in the chat. In just a moment. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to provide a little context to the research which we've undertaken. The potential role of nature-based solutions to address the climate and biodiversity crises has recently risen up the conservation and development agendas. Nature-based solutions have also been proposed as a tool for post-conflict environmental recovery and peace building. The conflict in Tigray is a humanitarian catastrophe, or has been, and like many other active conflicts, one whose horrors have been overshadowed by the invasion of Ukraine. Tigray is home to the world's longest running and perhaps most successful environmental restoration programs. In fact, it's been running for so long that no one called it a nature-based solution back then. It's a powerful example of how community-led environmental stewardship can help reduce vulnerability to climatic extremes. And as it's vital for agricultural livelihoods across much of Tigray, we wanted to study how it had been impacted by the conflict, how what we found might be applied to other conflict-affected areas, and how any harm to the restoration program should be addressed during Tigray's recovery. To explore those questions today, I'm delighted to welcome our three speakers. Teklehaymanot Weldemichel recently finished his PhD in human geography from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, where he also currently works as a postdoctoral research fellow. His research interests broadly include political ecology, environmental governance and justice, conservation and development politics, state violence, and the broader discourses of sustainable development. Enrique Schulteboon is a conservation scientist currently working at the Institute of Zoology at the Zoological Society of London. Her work focuses on understanding human impacts, such as land use change or climate change, on ecosystems at large spatial scales, using satellite remote sensing data. Henrike led the research for this project while she was a researcher at CEOBS. Jan Nyssen has worked at the Department of Geography at Ghent University, Belgium since 2007, becoming a full professor in 2014. He teaches courses on geomorphology, hydrology, microclimatology, and his research, undertaken mainly in Ethiopia since 1994, aims to contribute to the identification and quantification of changes in the coupled human environment system, with a focus on slope processes, hydrogeomorphology, land degradation, and resilience. We'll follow the presentations with a Q&A, so please post any questions you may have in the chat function at the bottom of your screens. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tekleh to talk a little bit about the humanitarian crisis in Tigray. Tekleh, the screen is yours.
Yeah, can you see my screen?
We can, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for organizing this, and thank you for the report, really interesting report. Today I will talk about the war and the siege in Tigray and its impact on the population. When I was in the call for this webinar, I was supposed to talk about the siege, like the siege and its humanitarian impact, but I don't see the war and the siege differently. So I consider there is a strong connection between the war and the siege, as I consider the siege as part of the warfare strategy by the Egyptian state and its allies. So I would, in the beginning, I will talk a little bit about the war and what kind of impact the war had on the population or has on the population, and then I will talk briefly about the siege, the ongoing siege, and how that's impacting the population. And this picture is from last week, taken in Mekelle, showing kids, IDPs living on the streets of Mekelle, begging for loaves of bread every day to survive. It shows the scale of desperation that people in Tigray are going through at the moment. So the war started 18 months ago, exactly 538 days ago. It involved the Ethiopian army, national armies of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and allied ethnic militias and security forces from Ethiopia's several regions, including but largely by Amhara region to the south of Tigray. And it also includes the Somali conscripts who were in secret training in Eritrea. And all these forces against Tigray's regional security forces. And the Tigray region, as you could see from a map, is located to the south of the Eritrean border and on the northern end of Ethiopia. And this also included deadly weapons and drones supplied by different powers like the UAE, Iran, Turkey, and China, among others. And this has been, it has involved several actors. It's very difficult to trace who is involved and who is not. The war has been devastating. We have seen extreme levels of violence against the region's population. And we have seen, I think a recent report showed that about 500,000 people may have died, both through rampant killing, indiscriminate shelling, and violence related to the war, but also due to humanitarian crisis related to the war, like famine, starvation, and death related to it. And we have also seen systematic destruction and looting of social and economic infrastructures of the region. When I say systematic, it is like nearly everything that people depend on for living has been devastated and looted through the war. And you could see the tragedy and the level of violence cannot be better captured than Manuel Ramos's graphic illustration you could see on the right side of the screen, where people were left to killed across the region and left for wild animals to feed on them. And we have seen, as I said, there has been a systematic destruction and looting of infrastructures. And like I said, every single factory, farm, businesses, and everything that people depended on has been destroyed and looted through this campaign. When I say the factors, if you go, like, satellite images have been updated recently, and you could see from town to town. If you go through the satellite image, you see every factory being burned down or destroyed, or something has happened to it. And we have also seen systematic destruction of schools and health centers and other social service providing facilities across the region. And in addition to the destruction, we have seen looting and transportation of private and public properties across the border to Eritrea and to the rest of Ethiopia. But one of the aspects of the war that characterizes war the most is the displacement of the population. The scale of this displacement is staggering. At some point, at the peak of the war, about 3.5 million people were displaced at one point or another. Currently, the UN estimates that there are more than 2 million people in displacement camps, not necessarily camps, but in this, they live as IDPs across Tigray. Large portion of this displaced population is from Western Tigray, which is still under occupation by Amhara and Eritrean forces. And the destruction cannot be more exemplified than the destruction of Almada garment factory that was based in Adwa, and which employed about 10,000 people, and on which many households, many families depended. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that half of the population of Adwa, nearly half of the population of Adwa, depended on the factory in one way or another. And now that factory is turned into ashes, and a lot of it, parts of it, has been looted and is transported to Eritrea. And now we have a siege, a full-scale siege. And one aspect of the war has been the suspension of all kinds of basic services like banking, telecom, power, transportation, and other services in large parts of Tigray throughout the war. From the beginning of the war in November 4, 2020, we have seen large parts of Tigray go blind, out of the grid, out of power, out of all kinds of services, telecom services, and banks were to a large degree suspended in most parts of Tigray, except in big towns when where banks had reopened briefly during the occupation. And in addition to the suspension of banking services in Tigray, bank accounts of Tigrayans across the country were suspended for a long time during the war, and they still remain in Tigray, in the rest of Tigray. And in June 2021, the Tigrayan forces recaptured the capital of Tigray, Mekelle, and large parts of Tigray, like I think about 70% of Tigray. And following the recapture of Mekelle, the Ethiopian government claimed to have declared ceasefire, which I see and I argue was a new form of violence, because the ceasefire wasn't an actual ceasefire. It was a siege and imposition of a new form of violence on the Tigrayan population. So following the liberation of Mekelle in June 28, 2021, Tigray has been put under a full siege, under a full blockade. That means there are no social services, even in the places where there were services at some point during the occupation. So telecom, banking, power, medicine, and all kinds of services that we people use in our everyday life are not in Tigray. So for large parts of Tigray, that has been the case throughout the war. But for Mekelle and the major places, those services were cut off at the end of June 2021. So almost no, in addition to the cutting of the basic services, almost no humanitarian assistance has been allowed to go into the region throughout the period of the last 10 months since June. So this is a report from the UN OCHA on the 31st of March. You could see that Tigray is in the hard to reach areas in terms of accessibility. That's the red part of the map is the Tigray region. And hard to reach areas, doesn't mean that it's hard to reach within the Tigray region. People could probably move, like walking around and all. Hard to reach is to mean that there is no humanitarian assistance, humanitarian supplies going into the region because there is a blockade on the borders of Tigray. So how does that affect the population in the region? So we have in the last 124 days since December the 4th, because that was the last day there was a convoy of humanitarian assistance coming in. Between December 14 and now, there has been only 140 trucks, 8 trucks going into Tigray, whereas the UN estimates that there is a need for 100 trucks every day in order to sustain life in Tigray. But there were only 140 trucks of aid that made it to Tigray, which is like less than 1.5 days of supply in the last 124 days. Between the beginning of August 2021 and the 31st of March 2022, only a single fuel truck entered Tigray. You can imagine this is a region of more than 6 million people, and there was only one fuel truck that was allowed to go into Tigray since August. And electricity supply has been largely interrupted, and installations, electric grid installations were targeted by airstrikes, intentionally targeted. And we have, like I said earlier, there are like over 2 million people remaining in IDP camps, IDP centers, which means without the humanitarian supplies going in, these people are living off nothing, like without any assistance from external humanitarian actors. And so the burden has been on the host communities in the cities and towns across Tigray. For the last 18 months, like almost every Tigrayan that resides in the parts where people are not displaced from has been generous enough to host communities, and they have been assisting people to survive. But now even the host communities have run out of supplies, because one, they haven't been paid for themselves. If they are workers, they haven't been paid for more than a year. If they have had businesses, they can't even access their own savings because banking services have been suspended and their accounts frozen. There was a report by the World Food Programme in January, on the 28th of January, which indicated that 83% of the people in Tigray are food insecure. They have become food insecure. And 2 million people, that's 37% of the population, are severely food insecure. This is equivalent to almost a famine, because level 5 in the IPC categories is famine. That's a catastrophe, a famine. And there is nothing like beyond that. Level 5 is the highest category in the IPC. And a large portion of the population is either in level 5 or close to it, level 4 in the IPC categories. You could see that from the map here, that the darker part of the map is where the population integrate. And 3/4 of the population is using extreme measures to feed themselves, which is they are selling their fixed assets like livestock, if they had livestock that they used to plow their land. They are selling their houses, they are selling everything that they have in order to survive. And that shows you to the extent of desperation that people are in. To just show you the comparison, because this is the map on the left that says before, that's October 2021, 2020, that's just 1 month before the start of the war. As you can see, the Tigray region on the top of the map had a minimal level of food insecurity. This is from the World Food Program projection at the time. And you could see the comparison now in 2022. Tigray is like in a very dark color, which is like almost an emergency level. It was an emergency level for a long time at the moment. So you could see the impact of the war and the siege on the population. And of course, the situation has really deteriorated since the publication of the WFP report in January, because there hasn't been any humanitarian supply going into the region. So we are hearing every day, we are hearing reports of deaths, like thousands of people dying. Like just the other day, we have seen reports of like more than about 2,000 children dying of starvation in recent months. We have also seen the closure of like the collapse of the health system, because there is no medical supply going into the region. So we have seen the health system collapsing. And the last news we heard is the closure of the last functioning hospital in Mekelle. That's either referral hospital, which was the only main functioning hospital in Tigray throughout the war. And now last week they declared that they couldn't provide, they don't have medical supplies for many of the kind of diseases that they used to cure, like chronic illnesses, but they also don't have food to supply to their patients. So they have now closed the like supply, providing food for their patients. And it's important, like the whole point of presenting the impact of the war and the siege together here is to show that the blockade or the siege is not on its own. It is part of the longer campaign of disenfranchising, impoverishing the population, and leading to this catastrophe. The siege only followed the destruction, the systematic destruction and looting that left the population without any resources to sustain living under siege. So it should be seen as an extension of the war campaign, the campaign to destroy the region. And I have actually tried to document how that process unfolded in an article that was published in Human Geography Journal in November, where I argue that this hellish situation was meant to happen. It was meant to unfold. If you follow all the actions that the allied forces, the Ethiopian government and its allies have been taking throughout the war. Thank you for your attention, and you can email me if you want to communicate about something. You can email me, or you can follow me on Twitter. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tekle. That's incredibly important and useful context for Henrike's discussion next. So we wanted to focus particularly over some of the conflicts we look at. We see quite serious environmental damage through damage to industrial sites or commercial sites, other issues around the collapse of environmental governance or management. In the case of Tigray, we wanted to look specifically at this question of how had the war impacted this system of ecological restoration, which had been going on for decades? And that's what Henrike will talk about now in her research.
Great. Let me just share the screen. Hopefully you can all see that now. Great. Yes. So I will be talking through the main findings of the report that has just been published on the CEOBS website and is focused on the environmental impact of the war in Tigray. And throughout this presentation, I'll be focusing on three main questions. The first is whether trees and shrubs have declined in Tigray during the war. The second question is, have those declines, if we see them, are they actually, have they been caused by the war or have they been caused by something else? And then thirdly, I'm just going to touch on what those findings might mean for people in Tigray now and going forward. And if you're interested in the full methodological details of the analysis, there's a full breakdown of the analysis and the results in the report on the CEOBS website. Whoops, just trying, doesn't want to, yeah, there we go. Okay, so before I start, I just want to acknowledge the help and invaluable input of a lot of people who've contributed to these reports, from Jan Nyssen, who you will hear from in a bit, Teklehaymanot Weldemichel, obviously, and then from CEOBS, Owen Derbyshire and Dagweir. So just to put this into context, Tigray during the 20th century and even before was a site of widespread land degradation. And this picture here, this was taken during an Italian military expedition in 1868, shows a kind of exemplary landscape, so quite bare with only shrubby vegetation. And you can imagine in these landscapes, when the rains come during the wet season, there's a lot of erosion and soil loss, and the water that enters the landscape through rain is just washed off and it doesn't really stay around, and that makes agriculture really difficult. And that was recognized by the beginning of the 21st century, and agricultural policy shifted from this traditional input on, or the traditional focus on fertilizers and other kinds of input, to creating a landscape that was better for agricultural productivity, a landscape that is better at holding onto soil and holding onto water so that that crops in the fields can grow better. And as part of the strategy, there was obviously a lot of physical soil and water conservation structure that was built, so dams and ponds and stone terraces, but also lots of exclosures were created. So areas where people voluntarily would no longer graze their livestock, would no longer cut down trees to allow the vegetation to come back on its own accord. And this picture sort of shows the success of this strategy. This was taken in, this shows the same exact landscape 140 years later. So you can see this incredible resurgence of vegetation, which has led to increases in, for instance, irrigated agriculture, in overall agricultural output, and it really contributed to an improvement in food security and livelihoods and the well-being of people in Tigray overall. So that was the situation before the war. And now, given that this war has created the situation where there's a complete blockade, so people can only depend on the things that are physically present in Tigray, now there's this threat that this landscape restoration success might be eroding. And we particularly focus in this report on potential impacts of the war on trees and shrubs, and that has a range of reasons. So one of them is that trees and shrubs are indeed a key component of landscape function or ecosystem functioning through their impacts on soil and water conservation. The second point is that trees and shrubs are relatively easy to monitor from space using satellite imagery. And I've just put up a quick screen grab from Google Earth here of a sort of shrubby landscape in Tigray, and you can see that the trees stand out really nicely against the background. They're greener, they have this characteristic round shape, and you can also see shadows, so they're fairly easy to make out in satellite imagery. And that means that we could do a rapid assessment in a situation where a ground-based analysis of environmental impact was impossible during the war. So there are two things that we need to know to answer this first question. One is we need to know where there were trees and shrubs before the war, and we can use satellite imagery and some limited ground truthing data available from before the war, from when people still had access, to create a land cover map. And then secondly, we need to know where there were changes in vegetation cover or condition during the war. And the way you can do that with satellite imagery is that you can look at changes in vegetation greenness. And we used a commonly used vegetation index here called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI, to characterize area where vegetation may have declined. So then this is the output of this first step, so the map of tree and shrub distribution across Tigray from before the war. I should say that the original map it has a resolution of 10 meters, but just for visualizing this and making it easier to pick up broad-scale patterns, I've aggregated it here to about 3 kilometers. And that map was really successful. It has an overall accuracy of 97%, and it just gives us an indication of where trees and shrubs occurred before the war started. So then we come up to the second part, which is where did vegetation cover and or condition change during the war? And we can't just take sort of averages of greenness, because in a region such as Tigray with pronounced dry and wet seasons, we have normal seasonal fluctuations in greenness anyway. So it's important that we distinguish significant shifts in greenness, declines in greenness, such as might occur due to deforestation, against a sort of background noise of normal seasonal changes. And you can use time series analysis to do that, to basically pick out pixels where greenness has overall declined significantly, even though there's of course this sort of background fluctuation happening. And similarly, you can look at pixels where greenness has increased, where maybe new trees have been planted or trees have grown quite a lot and are doing quite well. But of course, for this report, our focus is on this first situation, so where greenness has declined. And when we do that, we get this map. And again, this map is aggregated from the original map, which has a resolution of 30 meters. But I guess the most important takeaway from this map is that you can see these localized hotspots of tree and shrub cover loss. And then you have this diffuse area of loss in Western Tigray. So there have been quite significant losses of tree and shrub cover during the war. And this is what this looks like on the ground. So this is one of the areas where our analysis picked up a loss of vegetation greenness. This is what that area looked like in October 2020. That's a eucalyptus plantation. And just a month or 2 months after the war started, half of that site had been cleared, and you can see a charcoaling hearth as well, and we'll talk about that later. And then in February, the entire site had been cleared, and more charcoaling hearths had emerged. But of course, it's also important to look at areas where vegetation cover may have increased in Tigray during the war. And when we do that, we do actually find some areas where trees and shrubs are faring quite well. And details of this are in the full report. When we compare those areas to the situation in 2020 and 2019, it is much more subdued. So yes, there were areas where trees and shrubs were thriving in Tigray in 2021, but maybe not as much as we would have expected had there not been a war. And overall, the deforestation hotspots are also much more significant than in those previous years. So then the next question is, what is causing these declines? There are obviously many potential drivers for tree and shrub declines other than the war, and it's important to rule these out. And we specifically looked at the weather during 2021 here, so temperature and rainfall. We looked at wildfire, and we also looked at locust observations. And the way we did that was we assessed the spatial overlap between these potential drivers and the observed declines. So if those two patterns match, there's quite a strong likelihood that that driver is responsible for changes in tree and shrub cover. And if they don't match, then probably something else is going on. So just to remind us of where the main hotspots of vegetation loss are before we start to look at the drivers. So when we then look at temperature, for instance, yes, there are areas, especially in Western Tigray, where 2021 was a much hotter year than the previous years, but that can't really then explain any of the eastern hotspots of deforestation that we've seen. And similarly with rainfall, we actually have seen a lot of loss of trees and shrubs across sort of the southwestern and southeastern border, and yet these were actually areas that received more rainfall than was normal during the past 2 decades. And then wildfires, most wildfires that we see in Tigray occur in the west again. And it's important here to mention that the satellite data that we use to assess this has quite a coarse resolution. It's about 500 meters. So it is likely that smaller fires, such as may occur when you burn down individual houses or when sort of settlements burn that are not that big, you will just miss them because the satellite is not sensitive enough to pick them up. So what we're interested in for this analysis is sort of the large vegetation fires that cover quite a large area, because they're the ones that will likely affect trees and shrubs. And it's also quite interesting, I think, to look at the patterns of fires that have occurred during the past 2 decades, so in peace times. And again, we see this concentration of fires towards the west of Tigray, and that is probably due to climatic factors and the vegetation that prevails there, lots of flammable grasses, for instance. So from this analysis, it is unlikely that it is changes in patterns of wildfires that is driving the declines in trees that we've seen in 2021. And finally, we can look at locust outbreaks. That's obviously made very difficult because there's been no on-the-ground locust observation possible in Tigray during the war. So what we did instead was look at areas where locusts were observed really close to the border, because those are obviously the swarms that may have traveled in and out of Tigray and may have affected the vegetation within Tigray. But again, there's no clear correlation between the locust outbreaks that were observed really close to the Tigrayan border and the hotspots of tree and shrub loss that we see. So that then leads us to conclude that it is actually something about the conflict that is driving these losses. And when we talked to contacts within Tigray, they told us that indeed, in some places, the indigenous shrubs have been intensively cut for firewood and preparation of charcoal. And that is likely because due to the blockade, there's just no alternative sources of fuel for cooking, for instance. So charcoal cannot be imported into the region. There's no electricity. So people are kind of stuck with using locally sourced timber or charcoal to meet their fuel needs. And that obviously also echoes the Google Earth images we saw earlier, where we clearly see these charcoaling hearths. So that is what we think is driving these patterns of localized patterns of tree and shrub loss. So what does this loss of vegetation, what will that do to ecosystems and people in Tigray? And obviously, looking back to over the 20th century, we know that where vegetation is lost, there's likely an increased risk of erosion, a loss of water from the landscape, with all the negative impacts on agricultural productivity that entails. That is specifically worrying, given that already, as Tekle already mentioned, there is widespread famine in Tigray, and also a drought, a climatological drought is projected for this year and next year. And so clearly eroding the ability of the landscape to sustain productive agriculture now is really threatening short and long-term food security and livelihoods. So what needs to happen after the war? Clearly we need a full environmental impact assessments in Tigray and in other areas affected by the war, because we can't fully explain all, or we can't fully monitor all environmental impacts from space. We need ground-based assessment, for instance, on impacts on wildlife or the water cycle as well. It is clear that in Tigray, the overall recovery from the wars will be closely tied to environmental recovery to ensure food security and resilience. And that means that we'll need to focus on rebuilding the infrastructure that supports landscape restoration. And that means obviously the physical infrastructure, such as stone terraces or dams, but it also means the social infrastructure, the communities that have sustained the work that has led to this amazing landscape transformation that Tigray has seen in the 21st century. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions during the Q&A later. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Enrique. It's hopefully a very clear explanation of what's quite a complex story and a complex relationship, and also a fairly complex analysis of the satellite data. Please do put your questions in the Q&A using the function at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask the panelists or ask anyone for more explanation or clarity on some of the things we've been discussing so far. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Jan, who's going to talk a little bit about what needs to happen post-conflict and how some of the problems which we've picked up through the analysis should be addressed to help protect food security and livelihoods. Jan, you have the screen. And you unmute Jan as well.
You're on mute.
Jan, could you hit your unmute button?
That's one thing, but I have only a small. Can you hear me now?
Can do. Coming through loud and clear, yeah.
And I want to share my screen. Share on this one. Yeah. So do you hear me? See my screen?
Go ahead.
Okay, and I will bring a bit, what does this mean on the ground? I will try to focus on some areas in Tigray that I know and to see what these results that have been found due to the very high tech, because what Henrike is presenting in an accessible way, I think there is a lot of high tech behind it, and you can look to the report to see the methods. So she has already introduced the regreening of Tigray since the 1990s. I'm not going to repeat everything that has been said, just go to Google Scholar and you combine keywords exposure and Tigray, and you get 1,600 scientific papers about that, just to say how important it is. Huh? And exposure, again, the term is maybe new for some people. We speak about protected areas. You see an example here with regenerating vegetation without livestock and only controlled wood harvesting. I've witnessed all that since 1994. Now, this regreening it's not simple. It doesn't regrow simply like that. It has a whole effort. And I want to show a short film to you that shows what the people are doing were doing before the war.
But I had nothing more to offer. But my children have not abandoned me.
I hope the sound is coming.
They believe in me.
Because
And they work
regreening,
hard
it's also
every
doing physical
day
soil and water
to give me new
conservation. We are in a semi-arid area. So when people plant trees, they need to harvest water to make it into food. The whole
First,
community
I
will
need
come out
water.
and they decide.
And here are my
They have a
children
meeting and they
building
decide
walls
this year
and
we are
ditches
going
to retain the precious
we are
gift
going to
of the
convert them
rains.
into bushland or into forest. And then they work
Life
1
can sprout
month
more
in the slack
easily
season
in damp
or
soil. New plants mean less
restore it.
CO2 in the atmosphere and more branches and leaves falling to the ground. As they decompose, they can fertilize the land and boost the growth of new vegetation.
The storyline is based on interviews with people. They understand very well what they are doing when they are planting.
Then my children want to grow a forest on the mountains. New roots will give me stability. They will retain the rainwater and carry it to the plains.
By the way, on
The birth of the forest is a blessing, and not just for me.
It is part of a project.
Swarms of bees will have a new home, and my children will have honey to eat and sell in the market.
Of course, I give only a short abstract of this short section.
A tree means limitless resources. One of the most precious are the incense trees that only grow in the forests of our highlands.
You see a man harvesting
the same incense that has been here since time immemorial, the oldest in the world.
And the woman is then sorting it out and separating it and grading it in different categories because they can get different prices for it. So we have seen this map already in Henrike's presentation. These are the places where regreening is continuing. Trees grow by themselves. If you leave them, they simply grow, and regreening continues even if you don't plant. Especially if you start from a low vegetation like it used to be in Tigray. And then we have, of course, all these hotspots of declining vegetation. You see that 0 up to 10% in some areas. I'm going to focus on a couple of them. And of course, there was already this diffuse deforestation in Western Tigray. That is the area where there has been ethnic cleansing, which we would expect ethnic cleansing, less people, and the vegetation could regrow. The best hypothesis is that Western Tigray has become open access for all sorts of merchants and traders and thieves and whatever can come from Amhara region, to just like when the villages from where the Tigray people have been expulsed, they take all the iron sheets from the roofs. Every dot from that on that satellite image of a village is an iron roof that has been stolen. For the same, we assume that they also will go there for charcoaling and taking what they can from the forest. Then you see a few other hotspots rather in northwest Tigray, and that corresponds to the Tekeze River Gorge. I have shown the Tekeze River and some roads, and that Tekeze River Gorge, very few people are living there, and we have a savanna woodland, like we can see, very beautiful area, by the way, very hot, very difficult. But you see that you have the places where are the roads, where are the bridges, that are the places where traditionally people will go to harvest that wood. And especially in this case, it will be brought to the town of Shire and Aselase, because in Shire, most of the IDPs from Western Tigray are there. They are living in schools and in the open air and whatever, and they need to cook their food. So there is a lot of business bringing that wood from Tekeze to Shire. We have then Mekelle. I'll come back to that and talk about some of these pixels around Mekelle, where there's the pressure of the town, obvious. People are often without electricity. They need charcoal for firewood. You see then also this Rift Valley escarpment, a bit the green belt of Tigray, that is quite affected. And we have here an example of the Des'a forest. You see an example, a photo before the war, which is also quite, deforestation is locally taking place. We don't know. We couldn't have the information. Is this simply firewood, picking out firewood, or is this effectively logging that has been taking place for warfare, or is it charcoal making? Still needs to be investigated. I want to take you to one area that I know particularly well, that is called Dogatembian. And if you look to the pixels there, pixels of 3 kilometer by 3 kilometer, does not yet make much sense to you. We can add a river, we can add a few roads, and we can add a few places, and then I can build my story. You see that we are a bit, Mekelle is a bit, some 20 kilometers more to the east of this area. And you see places that are more hotspots. You see a very dark red pixel over there. And every grayish area is an exclosure. And part of a project in which we are active since many years. That's called Ethiopia. And here we take one pixel, and in the one pixel you have like a worm-like shape. That is the kidney-gested exclosure. And you see that over the whole pixel, not only the exclosure, but over the whole pixel, it's slightly red, indicating that 1% of the wooded areas in that pixel, they have seen a decline. We take now the same pixel, but then we see that 2%, seeing the color, 2% of that pixel has seen an improved situation, and 97% has remained stable. You can take another exclosure, Maibaati, and there was 0% with decline, 4% has improved, 96%. The trees continue growing, and 96% has remained stable. Reversely, in Konal, I was telling you this red pixel, there is 1% of the area has improved, 5% saw decline. You see how the area looked like before the war, and this is along a road to Mekelle. And this has always been, whenever there is a need, Mekelle will fetch its firewood, or people will bring firewood for the sake of business, will bring firewood to Mekelle. They have a road. There's an old bridge that is disused, but for going with donkeys and firewood, it's very nice to pass the river over there. And so we presume that the pressure from the town is leading to cutting of trees in that area. Reversely, we go far in the Geba Gorge. You have all these dark green pixels. 10% of the area has improved. It's very far from Mekelle, and this is a bit how it looks like, where the famous incense trees are growing, and it's difficult of access from Mekelle. And anyway, in such remote place, in this war situation, nobody dares to go there. Why would you go? Nobody will be there to help you if there be it a soldier or a shifta or a bandit or something. So people stay out from there, and the vegetation has benefited from that situation. But these are relatively few places in really remote places. What we hear from Tigray is that environmental protection remains a cornerstone. In the spirit of the people, the status of exclosures has even increased, because when the war came, when all these killer soldiers were there, they went into the exclosures for hiding. We have seen these exclosures very often. It are gorgeous, it's difficult terrain, and you can sit there and you can hide, and the soldiers don't find you. At least you can survive in that way. So it has a status. But of course, there is extreme poverty. There is a need for fuel. You see some photos of the fuel wood market in Mekelle now in February that was smuggled out thanks to some smuggler, let me say like that. You see that the back somebody, a woman who has maybe a business, needs some charcoal and is bargaining the charcoal. But you see especially that the wood are eucalyptus logs, dimensioned pieces of eucalyptus. And to some extent, the eucalyptus seems to be like a buffer and protecting, in fact, the natural vegetation. And people take out the eucalyptus for selling. You hardly see, probably because also it's forbidden and it will be a bit hidden, but you hardly see indigenous species, indigenous wood on this wood market. And then we have also studying the agrarian society with Beat Gilgan, who was with us, and there we did the reverse. The CEOBS study, they picked out the woody vegetation, woody areas. We picked out, Beat Gilgan picked out the croplands, and all the greenish cropland that looks greener, but this is before sowing. This is in spring. The croplands look greener, especially to Western Tigray. The croplands look greener because absence of plowing. The weeds are growing. You see here a study, and a second study paper is in publication in the journal Defense and Peace Economics. You have a photo and you see the farmer very late in the season and the land is still full of weeds. So definitely there has been, the cropping has been targeted. You have seen our papers, you can access them. One of our papers is very slow in reviewing because that's always when you publish in a scientific journal, the reviewer comes in, you have to put that in a broader context. Why don't you talk about Hitler's hunger plan against the Soviet Union in the 1940s? Yeah, sealing it off and dying the people in order to beat the enemy. Mengistu against Tigray in the 1980s. Now the regional policy in Tigray is that nobody can leave his land idle. Nobody can leave his land fallow. Everything is blockaded. We need to grow everything. But of course, this shows resilience. This shows that people want to survive. But on the other hand, this can put a stress on the marginal lands because areas that have a bit of shrubs, it could be cleared in order to grow crops because everybody is hungry. And our project, Ethio-Trees, and you can visit them on that website that is mentioned, they continue to work. They continue to do water harvesting structures. They meet the community and they try to smuggle in some money in order to give some food aid to the poorest of the poor in the villages. That's what we are trying to do for the moment. And thank you for your attention.
That's great. Thank you, Jan. That's fantastic to be able to connect the remote assessment with what's happening on the ground and your experience of working there. We've got time for a few questions. I'm going to try and merge a few because there are some which are fairly closely linked. I think one of them which has come through on a few is, how long will this the situation take to recover with peace and normalization? And so there's two elements of that, I suppose. There is one question of the vegetation changes. How long would that take to recover, given what you know about how vegetation grows in the region? And the second one is, how long do you think it will take for some of the socio-economic changes which have taken place, such as a shift to charcoal, to resolve itself and to change the market for charcoal? So I'll open that to all three of you, whoever would like to pitch in first. So one question on socio-economic changes from the conflict situation, the other one on how long does vegetation take to recover?
Yeah, I think like that is your wheelhouse. Yeah.
Tekle.
Yeah, I can talk about how long we will take to recover the forestation, because previously I had written a blog about the environmental impacts of the war on Tigray that was published in May, and during that, when I was writing that, I was following the interviews with government officials, like regional government officials at the time, and they were giving assessments. The head of the Bureau of Agriculture and Rural Development of Tigray at the time said that this war has reversed our work that the 40-year long work on environmental restoration, and he said this may take up to 50 years to go back to what it was like before the war. That may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it will take a lot of effort to get back to how it was before the war. That's what I can say. I think it will take a lot of effort. I think it would take a lot of reconnecting society and nature, society and the environment to get back to what it was like before the war.
Thanks, Tekle. Jan, do you have any thoughts on the vegetation side?
Yes. In my understanding, the damage will be spectacular, localized, and Enrique has shown some spectacular sites, and we should really walk through the whole Google Earth imagery where it is available, because that one, you can only find it back by visiting every pixel of hotspot to see what has happened. Probably there are other charcoal kilns throughout the landscape. In other places, the vegetation has continued to grow, though at a slower pace. So if it can be left right now, and if all of a sudden, if we switch everything, we give electricity is there, and communication is there, money is there, and so on, and all of a sudden that would appear magically, which is not the case, then I think still it would recover quite well if we go for the next planting season. And I'm very afraid that any marginal land steep on the slopes, encroaching on the forest, that if that will happen, then of course a lot of vegetation, more vegetation will be destroyed. When you have seen some of my photos, these slopes were barren or almost barren 40 years ago, 30 years ago. Yeah, you see what can grow in 30, 40 years. Everything has not been cut, but of course it is on the bed. This year it has been slowed down, but overall the tendency has not yet been reversed. But if we continue like that for a longer time, then it becomes difficult.
Thanks, Jan. Henny, did you want to pitch in as well?
No, that was. I think we're looking at the sort of decades in the recovery of, because when you cut down a tree, that's, trees take decades to come to maturity, and so when the tree's gone, that's the sort of time you have to spend again. But I guess what was really important in what Jan was saying, what Tekle touched on, that if the sort of human aspect of that, the end to the blockade and the restoration of electricity, all these things can drastically reduce the pressure on vegetation pretty quickly. So I think that is the most important thing that environmental policy can do right now.
Certainly. Maybe one question. I think it's something we came up in the report that we started out looking at. We were looking at the damage caused, but also there's this question about how the fact that the ecological restoration had taken place actually creates resilience for communities. And I just wondered if you, three of you, wanted to comment on that at all, about
you mean resilience for the communities?
Yeah, in terms of food security and livelihoods, setting aside the issue around forced displacement from areas, but what role do you think these kind of nature-based solutions have in these contexts and in these conflict contexts?
For the moment, so somehow it is contributing to the resilience of the communities, because people will go there, chop firewood and sell it to the towns in order to get some income. So they are seeing it also as an income generation, because it's not the people from Mekelle who go 50 kilometers with a donkey. It are people from the village who bring it to Mekelle. What we have seen, that the forests, the explosives are very important to help the infiltration. It's not a type of vegetation that is sucking out the water from the ground, mostly not. Yeah, the vegetation really helps to infiltrate and to feed the water table and to sustain the springs. For the moment, well, we have to see the impact on hydrology on springs. What we have seen in other studies, for the moment, the springs are more or less like they were. Yeah, so but it will again depend on what will happen in the. I think when we look to livelihood, you have two types of benefits for the community from this type of exposures. One is, you have seen the incense, you have seen the honey, you have seen people taking firewood or controlled pruning of trees and this type of things, grass harvesting. Then you have the effect on the water table and sustaining the springs. For the moment, it has not yet been reversed. It has declined. It has not yet been. Reversed. But the people will say this type of exposure, and they see what you see. You have seen of some of my photos. We would call it a shrub, but this is 4 or 5 meters high. This has grown in a short time. People are saying we are covering our mountains like the coat that you put on your back when it is raining. And so we are really protecting, and we are really keeping our mountains thanks to that vegetation. So they clearly see the benefits, what we would call ecosystem services. They clearly understand that. I'm very happy that what the study has shown, that it could have been worse. Yeah, there has been targeting. There has been places where it has been deliberately put on fire, but mostly in order to frighten the people.
Thanks, Jan. We're just coming up to time, so I shall ask for a very quick summary. Specifically, what needs to happen now, and how can the grassroots community response and also the regional response be supported? What are your main priorities? Really quickly, each of you. Tekle, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and that's the whole point of this this presentation. And I think, like we were talking about, like recovery of this of the environmental protection will take a lot of effort, and the effort will include like prioritizing what kind of sectors to what kind of support to provide to local communities in terms of, like, for example, energy consumption, in terms of what kind of infrastructures to put in place in order for people to encourage people to restore their degraded environment. And I think that's something that we all need to think about, something that donors and governments need to think about. And I think the local communities, local government has all the thinking and the interest there, because they have been practicing it for a long time. It's just that we need to help them get back to how it was before. Yeah.
Thanks, Tekle. Jan, very quickly, what needs to happen next?
Well, I was showing that in one of my last slides. Lifting the blockade would help enormously. Lifting the blockade would make sure that there is electricity, would make sure that people have money in their bank account, but they cannot take it. Yep. People are not getting salaries, etc. So what do you do if you are a young boy and you don't have salary? You go somewhere and you start chopping wood and selling it rather than sitting and dying at home. So lifting the blockade is so urgent. And then, of course, we will need to support the efforts of environmental protection and the communities that, and it's all, all these exposures. You must imagine we are speaking about millions of people who have been working on those slopes to protect them and are just waiting to be able to start it again.
Thanks, Jan. Henny, I shall leave a last word to you. What are your priorities next based on the research you've done?
All of what Tekle and Jan have said, and I will add one thing, which is the recovery of the people who are currently internally displaced in Tigray, and that is because the entire success of the landscape restoration in Tigray rested primarily on local communities organizing themselves and having these kind of networks of relationships that allowed people to contribute to the restoration of their local environment. And so allowing people to return to their homes and to go back to what they were doing before the war, and to reweave these networks of relationships, that's going to be crucial to the continued success of the work that people have been carrying out in Tigray for the past few decades.
That's great. Thank you, Henny. So that brings us to a close. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been great to see so many people on here and interacting. Thank you very much to all our speakers, to Henny from ZSL, to Jan from University of Ghent, and Tekle from University of Oslo, Technical University of Oslo.
University of Science and Technology in Trondheim.
That's a long acronym. Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us, and a recording of this will be up on our YouTube channel in a couple of hours. Great. Thank you very much.